This box hasn't been out in a while, since I use it when I teach my Absolute Beginners workshop. So what lives in this box, in a way, is kind of a history of my sewing life. There's a lot of fabrics in especially in this part of the box, that are scraps left over from old projects of mine. Now, I'm not going through all of them. I learned very early in my teaching career that I can't actually tell you about every garment I've made over the years. In Absolute Beginners, we work only with woven fabrics. We'll leave knits for another day. What we're going to do today is talk about the absolute basics. The first thing I'm going to explain to you is fabric grain. If you've ever looked at a sewing pattern, you'll see it has something called a grain line. And what that grain line is usually referring to is this, which is your lengthwise grain. Now, let's turn this around so that actually the camera can see this word right way up. I've also labeled cross grain here. And I've labeled something else true bias, 45 degrees. So I'm hoping that getting this loom out will help explain how woven fabrics are actually made. It starts with the warp. That's these long, tight threads that go top to bottom. And then you have the weft, which I'm doing here. As you see, I'm going over and under the warp threads with my thread. Oh, and then I'm going to need to tighten my warp back up. The warp threads are super tight. The weft threads less so because they go over and under, as you can see. So it effectively takes a bit more thread. So you have more thread in your weft, which basically means you end up with a bit more flexibility in your fabric on what's called the cross grain. So the cross grain is made by the weft, and the lengthwise grain is the warp. And it's that tightness of the warp threads, how they're pulled taut before you weave, that gives the lengthwise grain of the fabric its stability and its strength. You might begin to understand how woven fabric can behave differently depending on which way you orient the fabric. Now, if I was to pull on my fabric in this direction, there's a little bit of give because I'm actually putting a lot of force on it. If I was to exert the same amount of force on this side, I've created a slight curve at the edges here. What I was doing here was I was pulling on those weft threads, and they're looser, so they give a bit more. So that's why it makes sense when you're particularly making a garment that you would want the lengthwise to be what hangs vertically and the crosswise to be what goes around the body. It has minimal flexibility, but a little bit more. When I teach this, I usually pass around a square of fabric that looks a bit like this without the labeling, and I ask my students to see if they can identify which is the lengthwise, which is the cross, and which is the bias. Now, the bias is the easiest to figure out. If you were to pull this fabric by the corners, see what happens? It stretches and it folds up, and it actually makes, look at these folds, they're like perfect. It just gives you these exactly, identical, beautiful folds. It doesn't crease, it folds. And the reason it works like that is because the fabric's actually being pulled along where the threads cross in like an X shape, right? So diagonally, the threads at this point are running diagonally to the way you're holding it. And that X shape is flexible. And it works best, of course, in fabrics that have beautiful drape. And you see it much better in fabrics that are, in bigger pieces of fabric. But even here, you can see I'm holding this by the corner, and it is just folding into a nice rounded drape. Now, of course, if you've just bought some fabric, it's going to be pretty obvious where the grain lines are, because it'll still have its selvage. I've seen selvage spelled a couple different ways. Selvedge and Selvage. Pronounced the same, means the same, so I wouldn't worry too much about how you spell it. But what it is, it's the bit of the fabric that denotes the lengthwise grain. So you know when it comes off the bolt, when you can see this, the direction that goes is the direction of your lengthwise grain. So if you're cutting out from a pattern, if you have a commercial pattern or something and it shows a grain line, you want to run your grain line of the pattern piece parallel to this selvage. Now, normally I say to my students, cut the selvage off because it behaves differently, and you can imagine it does. It's much more tightly woven. So you really don't want that in a garment. You don't want to sew a seam through it because it's going to behave differently. It's not going to do what the fabric does, and that can be important. But by the same token, sometimes you have a selvage that just looks pretty amazing, and it would be a shame to waste it. So for instance, on this fabric, I would find a way to use that on a button placket or a pocket edging or something like that, just to show it off because it looks really good. Denims often have really interesting selvages, and I'll sometimes turn the waistband the wrong way around on jeans or on a denim skirt so that you can actually show off that. It can even be useful in a place where you want extra stability because of the super tight nature of the weave. But that very tightness can destroy the drape and flow of a regular seam. I think that is pretty much Fabric 101. The main thing I want you to take away is understanding grain and why it's important. And my box can go back under the desk until I teach this in person again.